So I know that we start with the best part of the 2 hours event. We have Dr. Celina Ramjoué, who is leading. She's the deputy head of unit. She's leading the data policy innovation part of unit of DG Connect. As you know, is one of the major part of the European Commission funding support towards the scientific community. So we're very, very pleased to have her. Celina comes from a long background of open access, data. I mean, she has been growing up with data. No? You didn't grow up with data?
Absolutely. Yes, I did grow up with data.
So she's definitely very, very relevant, very competent in the field. And we start with her, who will give us a speech. The title is?
I called it the role of research data for building the European data economy.
What else? Okay, thank you. The floor is yours. Yes, please do come in. Yes, you're still in time. Yes.
Yes?
Yeah, yes.
Ah, you mean them.
Yes,
Okay.
Three places. Yes.
So.
Keep it on the front. They're not reserved. Don't be scared. We don't fight.
So thank you, Fabrizio, for the kind introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here at the Research Data Alliance. The Industry Forum is a particularly fitting place for my talk, I think, because what I'll be trying to do today is talk about the role of research data for building the European data economy, so going beyond the world of science and research. So as Fabrizio said, I work for the European Commission's DG Connect, which is the Directorate General which deals with everything information technology. And within that DG, there are many parts, and I am in the unit that deals with data policy in a horizontal way. So you'll see that during my presentation. We look at data policy in a horizontal way, but there are many other colleagues, of course, some of them are in this room, and some of them deal especially with research data policy. So our unit doesn't deal with that, but I've dealt with that in the past. So what I want to do today is try to bring those policy strands together. So here's the outline of what I want to go through today. So first, I just want to say a few words about the potential of data. Then I will run through European policies on data that exist. And then at the end, I will go through some next steps, and especially I will be focusing on bringing all the policy strands together. And up front, though, I did want to emphasize how much research and research data is present in these topics. So everything I've put in green there relates specifically to research and research data. But we'll be going through this now step by step, so I won't highlight the individual points on this slide. So the potential of data. Of course, everybody in this room believes that data is important, research data in particular. The Commission funded a study done by the International Data Consortium that underlies exactly this. So what this study did, and it was updated very recently, is that it identifies 3 different scenarios for where we could go with data. So we have the baseline scenario, which means that basically everything continues as is. We don't change anything in our policies. Then we have the high growth scenario, which means that we maximize policies and achieve the best out of data. And then we have a so-called challenge scenario, in which we have a fragmented market and a very weak demand and low data sharing. So to put some figures on this, basically in this study, what comes out is that if you follow a high growth scenario, you could actually reach, by 2020, 739 billion euros worth of data market, which is a 4% worth of the EU's GDP. If you stay in a baseline scenario, you are at 452 billion euros for 2.6% of GDP. And in the challenge scenario, where actually you go down from today, you are even less, 354 billion euro, 2.2% of GDP. So naturally, what we would like as the European Commission is to reach a high growth scenario. And the question is how to do it, or rather from my perspective, from our perspective as policymakers and funders of research and innovation, is how we can do that in that role. So this is where I move on to the section on European policies and data. And I start with framing the whole picture, because as you probably know, the European Commission likes every few years to have a kind of a big program that they fit everything into they're going to do. In this case, for everything digital, it's called the Digital Single Market Strategy, the DSM, you might have heard. And this has many different chapters, all dealing with digital issues. And one of them is specifically on the data economy. So this, under the current commission, the Juncker Commission, is what frames all the work that we do on the data economy. And we have currently a commissioner in charge of digital issues who's very supportive of this approach. Andrus Ansip, Vice President of the Commission, says data should be able to flow freely across borders and within a single data space. We need a coordinated and pan-European approach to make the most of data opportunities, building on strong EU rules to protect personal data and privacy. And here he touches on one of the important founding stones, which is data protection, and I will come to that. Indeed, I come to that now. So if you will, what I did now is framing one, the digital single market strategy, and framing two, for everything we do on data, are data protection rules. So you probably have heard that there are now new harmonized data protection rules that will come into force next year. And these are important because they give a frame for personal data. Anonymized personal data is actually treated like non-personal data. And any transfer of data outside the EU is subject to the same level of protection. Data subjects have a right to data portability, so data can be moved around. There are exceptions for research of a quite wide range. Now, what I'd like to emphasize here is not data protection in itself, which I think for many Europeans is extremely important, but the fact that because these rules exist, there are rules that also make data flow. So if you give your consent, data can do things. Data can be ported. The point is that those rules don't exist for other types of data. So the GDPR, of course, in the minds of citizens is first and foremost a data protection instrument, and that's very important. But if you're thinking of the data economy in a way, it's also a way to make data be able to move and to be reused if consent is given. Now we move on to, I would say, data type number one, because I'm going to cover three types of data. Data type number one is government data, which we also call sometimes public sector information. So public sector produces lots and lots of data. Think, for example, of statistics. And it's also a major user of data for policymaking. It's increasingly digital, this data, if you think of e-government, if you think of smart cities, and as such is also a key contributor to the data economy. So the legal instrument that exists for government data is the Public Sector Information Directive. It's a directive from 2003, which has been revised once in the meantime. And basically, what does it say? It says that government-produced data should be open. Basically, that's kind of the very basic premise. And there's a right to reuse this information. So that's a very basic principle that's stated. Behind that is, of course, is the idea that there's taxpayers' money in that public sector information. So reuse should be possible. And what's interesting to highlight here is that this instrument has gone from more of a competition instrument back in the early 2000s, when really the idea was to make the most of public sector information to make the economy grow. That's still the case, but today it's also really become an open data instrument. Because open data now, when we say open data, we mean open government data. It's a bit confusing because it could also mean open research data, but that's what's meant at the EU level. We have infrastructure that supports this kind of open data, public sector information. The European Data Portal. So this is really this is a collection of European national portals that collect government data in the different member states. One of these portals is the Open Data Portal, which is the EU's portal on the data that the EU produces. So you have 29 portals there that are brought together in the European Data Portal. So the message here, infrastructure is also provided for open data. Now I move on to data type number 2, research data, which is certainly the type of data which interests this audience most, which this audience knows most about, and which other colleagues deal with in the Commission. So with a tribute to them, and also to my past work on this area, some information on this area. So here, the framing is called open science. So this is really the mantra, I would say, surrounding everything that we do at European level on research data. So the idea is that openness is good for science because it makes, it limits duplication in research, it ensures verifiability, and ensures that you can replicate research. So that's the baseline. And I remember back in the time when we started working on open access at the time, that was really the rationale. It's good for science. But then that's not all. Openness is also good for the economy because the results of what comes out of publicly funded research can be taken up by any actors, including business actors. So SMEs, for instance. And then connected with that, openness is good for society. Through openness, there's a higher level in trust by the citizen, by civil society. And open and collaborative research practices lead to more responsiveness of research and to the fact that it can adapt better to societal challenges. So this is the framing for the policy on research data that I'm going to explain now. So what we have in place now is a policy in Horizon 2020, which is the European Union's main research and innovation funding program. And basically what we have is a pilot in Horizon 2020, which is very extensive because by now it was so successful that it by now covers all of Horizon 2020 as of 2017. What do grantees of our research projects have to do? They have to deposit research data, underlying research data, so connected with research publications, and also research data of their choice into a repository. So the first thing they need to do is deposit. We're not talking about openness yet, but about deposit just to make sure the research data is somewhere. Step 2, they have to take measures to grant open access to this data. Another very important element of the pilot on open research data is the emphasis on fair research data. So findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. And very important to this is the policy that all projects taking part in the pilot, and by now they're all of them, almost, need to have a data management plan. So I always used to like to say that the pilot is actually more about training data management than necessarily opening, because managing your data correctly is the first step. Then you can discuss opening if that's possible and feasible. So indeed, in that context, opting out of the pilot is possible for a series of reasons, including IPR protection, data protection, security, and confidentiality. The pilot is relatively successful. So so basically, from all those that have to be in, 65% stay in and 35% opt out. So we have a good sample there to work with. And Other areas, you have a voluntary opt-in rate of 14%. These figures come from before 2017, when not everybody needed to be part of the pilot. And there's an infrastructure also for research data, for scientific data, which takes the form of the European Open Science Cloud, EOSC, which many of you have probably heard of. So this was a result or something announced by the European Cloud Initiative communication a year ago. And the EOSC contains many different elements. So here are some of the things that the EOSC is setting out to do. So it should ensure data stewardship, standard setting and certification, cataloging of research data, provision of core services. And services, I think, is a really key term to the EOSC, because the idea really is to provide services to the research community so that the research community can access and reuse data. And then there's also a governance layer, which consists of establishing rules of engagement and agenda setting. So that's the infrastructure for data type 2. Now I move to text and data mining, which to me belongs to research data, because that is how it was framed. But actually text and data mining could apply to any type of data. But it belongs to research data for now in the context of the copyright reform. So what happened here is that in the copyright directive, there was already a possibility for an exception for research data. So copyrighted material could be exempt if, for research purposes. But what there is now, there's a proposal on the table to make it possible to text and data mine for research purposes. So this is special in that it's a special tool which will actually enable to reuse in a machine access way. And I think that's the new thing about this proposal. This is on the table. It's not yet decided. And I want to emphasize again, it's been connected to research. So it's for research purposes, but it could actually go further. And now I move to data type 3, industrial data. So this is the youngest area for policy activity for the Commission, and we just adopted a communication this year in January called Building a European Data Economy. The point of departure here is that there's a need to access and exploit industry-held data better. Basically, there's a knowledge that it's out there, that it exists, and it's not very well used. That's the point of departure. There's a focus on non-personal machine-generated data. I say a focus because it's very, very difficult to say it's only on non-personal data and it's only on machine-generated data, because the lines are blurred. But that is definitely the focus. Why? Because this is the data that we haven't dealt with yet at all. So think sensor data. Think the data produced by your smartphone. Think of the data produced by a connected car. That's the kind of data that we're talking about. What happens today is that this kind of data isn't really regulated anyway. So what happens is that contracts come in and address this issue. Typically, there are contracts within a value chain. So a company will license the use of certain data to another company for certain purposes. The trouble is that we don't know what's in these contracts, and weaker actors in the market, SMEs for example, don't really have access to legal advice, so there isn't really a level playing field in terms of what kind of contracts there are. So one could imagine model contracts, for example. So the situation is one of data silos, typically in large companies, of de facto ownership, not real ownership, but de facto ownership of this kind of data. And as a result, we imagine that innovation is hampered. So the objective here is to facilitate business-to-business sharing and trading. So the communication has different chapters. One of them is on the free flow of data. Now, what this means in EU speak is national data localization restrictions. It actually means data stuck or caught in one member state because there's a particular national or local rule which makes it have to be there. For example, health data or tax data. These are typical examples. Then there's a chapter on access and transfer, and that's the one that's most relevant in the context discussed here. Then there's portability, not postability, portability, interoperability, and standards, and liability. Those are the kind of what we call emerging issues related to data. And then finally, there's a chapter on experimentation. Experimentation means places where we could test all these issues. So for instance, there's going to be a corridor for connected cars set up, and the idea there is to test data ownership, portability, liability, and so on. So now in terms of possible actions, so this is an area which is very new, quite immature, and whenever we talk to stakeholders, we realize it's just really much too early to intervene. The communication does, though, set forward a series of possible actions, which go from very soft to much harder. So one possible way to intervene is simply by facilitating the formulation of guidance on data sharing. Then you can foster technical solutions to identify and exchange data, for example, via APIs. Then, I already alluded to that, you can support the formulation of model contract rules, for example, for licensing data. Then there's an action underlined which is a bit different. It's access for public interest and scientific purposes. I put scientific purposes in red because of the link to research. This is not only a B2B option. This is access by public actors to business data for specific purposes. I highlight it because it's a bit different. Then there's the option to establish a data producer's right. So really to say, for instance, the car manufacturer is the owner of the data generated in the smart car. And then finally, establishing access against remuneration mechanisms. So that really means sort of forcing licensing of data in certain situations. So since we don't know really what to do in this area, to put it very bluntly, and we realize it's an immature area, we have now a structured dialogue, as we call it, which consists of a dialogue with member states and stakeholders, and also of a public online consultation, which is open till the end of April. So if you have any interest in this area, please do respond, because this will be a really important source of input. It's not one of those consultations that we just go through the moves. No, this is somewhere where we really don't know exactly what we're going to do. So input is crucial, and it's a long questionnaire, and there are sections on all the different chapters. You don't have to answer everything. So you can answer only one question if you think that's relevant for you. There's a chapter on access to data. And this is perhaps the most interesting to you. We're also going to have other studies and a series of workshops, all before the summer. There's also activities on infrastructure for this kind of data, for industrial data, which we summarize under the heading Industrial Data Platforms. So the idea here is that it would be useful to have a virtual environment to facilitate, basically, B2B sharing. And we see that as a place where you can enable data sharing, because today the situation you have is that companies, so the data that they want to reuse themselves, they reuse. When they have clear value chain connections, that's also dealt with, but there may actually be data there lying kind of unused that may be useful to someone else. And by putting in place data platforms, you could actually facilitate data trading. And I emphasize trading. It doesn't mean it's for free. It just means that it becomes available. So what we do there is that there's specific action on industrial data platforms within the context of the Digitizing European Industry initiative. And then we also have a call open in Horizon 2020 called iSpaces, and that's specifically to fund this kind of data platform. And now I come to a summary where I try to bring it all together. And I view this as really as my personal challenge because, well, I'll tell you now. So the data economy, I think, will really flourish only if data is accessible and reusable. That's kind of point of departure. Across borders, for and by different types of organizations, meaning private, public, research organizations, and for and by different sectors, energy, manufacturing, and I add across disciplines for this audience, okay? So data from everywhere across all types of borders and boundaries. So having a large reservoir of data available for reuse will make it possible to build new information services and to allow for searching of patterns, correlations, and that will actually enable the emergence of ideas to answer societal challenges. To cite just two examples in which different types of data coming together can be beneficial. If you take epidemics, for instance, so you can imagine research data on epidemics, actually looking scientifically into the epidemic, the symptoms and so on. And then you can look also at government data. So for example, the data generated by hospitals treating epidemics. And then finally, if you add to that tweets, so that's private sector information, which also contain a lot of information on what's happening with an epidemic, you really can unleash the power of data in all sorts of ways which probably are not even imaginable. That's one example. Another is smart cities, where types of data really come together in an amazing way. So you have government data. So, for example, information on transport, on traffic, this kind of thing. And with that, environmental type data, statistics. And then what's interesting with smart cities is that you can bring that together with a governance layer. So for example, you imagine an app on transportation or on mobility. For example, how I get from point A to point B, which is what we all have anyway. But then imagine that you add to that information on parking, for instance. So how I can best park my car, how much it costs, and so on. And then I rate that at the end, how it was. And then this feeds back into the evaluation of my city government, for example. So bringing all these types of data together, you really can imagine new and better, I hope, things. So the conclusion to this is that it really has to be legally and technical, very important, technically possible, not only to access and reuse, but also to blend and combine data and also the tools that are necessary. So, yes, and this is the same thing kind of in a diagram. So combining those three types of data really can lead to innovation. That's the message. And to come back again to research. So I think in what I've gone through, it's really become clear that research data is absolutely ubiquitous and that it's key, but that you could have done the same thing for other types of data. So in the end, it doesn't really matter because researchers use other data for their research, and research data is important for governments and industry. So actually, these distinctions are not that important, and the reason that I've made them so clearly is because that's how our policies are made up to now. So next steps, bringing it all together. So we clearly have separate policy streams. So I would ask the question to myself, to my hierarchy, and to you, isn't it time to bring all this together? We have the same situation for infrastructures. So we have different infrastructures for different types of data. Certainly this isn't the best way forward. So the European Open Science Cloud already is connected to the idea of widening, because in the European Cloud Initiative, there's a pillar that says that the European Open Science Cloud will widen to government, health data, and to industry data. So I think not right away, this will take time, but in some way, infrastructure must also converge. And then the other thing to do, and this is a policymaker reflection, is probably the best thing is now to work with existing instruments. So the Public Sector Information Directive, the policies we have on open research data, the Database Directive, which I haven't mentioned explicitly, but is also very important for data, and so on. So the next milestone we have in terms of policymaking on data is the Digital Single Market Midterm Review communication. It will be a communication, which is actually coming out very soon, and which will hopefully lead us in the right direction. And I think that's the end. Thank you.